Hello, everyone. I'm just going to start by welcoming you all to today's event. We will be discussing fiction, biography, a conversation with Nuala O'Connor and Eibhear Walshe. And I just want to thank everyone for being with us today. Thank the panelists, thank our moderator, everybody for sharing this work with us. And I'm going to begin just by thanking our co-sponsors and then introducing Heather Bryant, who'll be our moderator. So today's event is sponsored by a number of different institutions, and I just want to thank them all for helping put this on. The first is the New York City Irish Studies Consortium, Columbia University Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, NYU's Glucksman Ireland House, the Wellesley College Writing Program, and Columbia University Seminar in Irish Studies. So thank you all so much for helping to sponsor this event and spreading the word. I will be sharing in the chat for today information about how to buy the two books that we're celebrating today. The first book is Nuala O'Connor's Nora, A Love Story of Nora and James Joyce by HarperCollins. And that's going to be available at Shakespeare & Company, and I'm going to put that link in. I also want to mention that today is the US premiere of Nora, so we're really excited to be talking about it. The second book is Eibhear Walshe's The Last Day at Bowen's Court by Somerville Press. And I will also be sharing the link for how to purchase that book today. So without further ado, I will introduce Heather Bryant, who will be moderating our discussion. And just to give you a sense of the format for today, we'll have about 30 minutes of moderated discussion followed by an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions you want to ask, go ahead and put those in the Q&A box. Heather Bryant teaches in the writing program at Wellesley College. She is the author of the prize-winning book, Elizabeth Bowen and the Landscape of War, and 10 books of poetry, including James Joyce's Water Closet, a title that I very much enjoy. She is currently at work on a book of essays, a memoir, and snapshots. So I'm going to pass things over to Heather, who will lead us off with introductions to our speakers.
Well, thank you all for this event. It's very exciting. Very happy to be moderating and want to introduce our two authors, Nuala O'Connor, who lives in County Galway, Ireland. Her fifth novel, as Emily mentioned, Nora, is coming out today in the US. And it's going to be coming out in Ireland in April of 2021. And it's a book about Nora Barnacle, the wife and muse of James Joyce. And it's a wonderful imaginative recreation and fiction. And she's also has a new chapbook of historical Irish fiction, Birdie, which was recently published by Arlen House. And she's the editor at the Flash e-zine Splunk. I'm very happy to meet her. I just met her yesterday for the first time. And then we have Eibhear Walshe, who I've known for many years when he invited me to the Bowen Centenary. And we've had a lot of adventures since then. But he's a memoirist, novelist, biographer, critic, extraordinarily prolific and varied writer. He's also chair of the creative writing program at UCC. And his many publications include works on Oscar Wilde, a novel on Handel, his own memoir, book on Kate O'Brien, and many more. But today he's going to be talking about his recreation of Bowen's, a very important part of Bowen's life, The Last Day in Bowen's Court. And these two books together are vivid reimaginings of writers and the people close to them, which is what makes them so magical. And it also, both books have a really interesting interplay of writer and muse, and who writers take their influence from, and what the people around those writers take from the writers. So I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to start with a couple questions, or start with one question, and then we'll see where we go. So my first question is, starting at the beginning, how did you each conceive of the ideas for these books? Because they're very imaginatively rich books. And I'm curious, it's always fun to hear how an idea germinated for a writer. And Nuala, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I suppose I had already written biofictions about Emily Dickinson and about Belle Bilton, who was a music hall dancer. And so I was in the mode, I suppose, for a few years of writing about women who had been smudged a bit by history. And I wanted to bring them into the limelight. For the Nora book, I was studying Italian by night in NUI Galway, and as part of my course, I had to write an essay about the friendship between Joyce and Italo Svevo, who was a novelist in Trieste. And I found doing the research, I was always squinting over the shoulder of the two men to try and see what Nora was up to. And I became kind of re-interested in Nora, I suppose, as an individual. I dug out my teenage copy of Brenda Maddox's wonderful biography of Nora, which is called Nora, The Real Life of Molly Bloom. I highly recommend it. And read it again. Around the same time, I rescued a cat from the cat's home, and I called her Nora Barnacle. And so there was just this kind of swill of stuff. So I did what I sort of always do. I wrote something small to test the waters, in a sense. So in this case, I wrote a short story called Goosine, which was about when Nora and James met, and just up until the time they depart for Europe. But I found I just didn't want to let them go. I wanted to stay with Nora. I wanted to continue my communion with her, in a sense, and see what happened after that. I knew kind of in my head what happened, but I wanted to be there with her, which is the thing that biofiction can do. You enter the personal and the emotional and the reacting life of the individual, and you see what questions were raised by the life and how you can answer them. And so that's what I started to do.
It's fantastic. Thank you.
Well, what really fascinated me and got me sort of working on the novel and the idea of the novel was the fact that I think the best novel of the Second World War is Elizabeth Bowen's The Heat of the Day. I love it. I think it's a wonderful novel, and she's one of my favorite writers. And something occurred to me about it. The novel is dedicated to Charles Ritchie, who was a Canadian diplomat. And Bowen published the novel in 1948 when the war was over, dedicates it to Charles Ritchie, while still living very happily with her husband, Alan Cameron, in the same year that Charles Ritchie marries. So how do you do that? How do you write an outstanding novel which draws upon your wartime love affair, which it did, the love affair between Elizabeth Bowen and Charles Ritchie, who was there working in the Canadian Embassy? How do you manage that? How do you manage to write this wonderful novel, celebrate your love affair, stay married happily to your husband, which you do, in the year that that lover marries? So I thought, I bet this was not seamless. And so I wrote the novel from all 4 points of view. I mean, the central novel really is the idea of Bowen writing during the war, writing at a time of great danger, and also at the time of the most important love affair of her life. Not of his life, but of her life. And how this love affair, which was so important for her, which really was a wartime affair for him, amongst others, and he was very honest about that, how it ends up being, they end up sort of together imaginatively forever as a result. So I suppose, having written a lot of work academically on Bowen and living in Cork and being so near Bowen's court and all those kinds of things, I really just thought, I can try this, which is very arrogant in the sense that you're taking on the life of one of the writers you love the most. Again, as Nuala does, I love Joyce too, and that's what I loved about her book. So much of Joyce and his writing, and if Nora's own work is in it. But you have to be that sort of, you have to take on that challenge and do it. And the only thing you bring to it is your love of the work and your sense of the story behind the story to be told.
Yeah, thank you. I have to say that having just read Nuala's book for the first time and then rereading Eibhear's book, what I'm struck by is how you gave us these worlds that we just entered into without question. At least on my part, I was just completely in the world. And as you both mentioned, writing this kind of work contains a lot of challenges, complexities and intrigues. And I wondered if you could speak a bit about what were the challenges, what kept you up at night wondering what was about. I mean, one of them is, sort of encountering these people who were real people, and then transforming them into your own imaginative works. So if you want to take a stab at that, maybe Ava, you start, and then
Yeah,
Nuala.
and then Nuala will have her sense of it. I actually didn't find that hard. I mean, once I got into the book, I found no difficult. I mean, I write books about dead people, and I'm like Bowen. I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm terrified of them. And I always wonder why am I afraid of these people coming back to smite me in the middle of the night for my temerity. But actually, once I got into it, I found myself effortlessly, sort of channeling them all, and none of them are like me. I mean, Elizabeth Bowen is an Anglo-Irish woman of a very different class to my own. Charles Ritchie, Canadian, his cousin and wife Sylvia, also a Canadian, Alan Cameron, Englishman of very different worlds. All four inhabited what I wanted to do. And I suppose the only thing I could feel was in any portrayal of any two marriages, as we see in one relationship, nobody's in the wrong, nobody's in the right. There are a series of events and powers and struggles and things that happen. And that's what I tried to, I suppose, give justice to, because you could see Charles Ritchie and Elizabeth Bowen as the powerful ones and their long-suffering spouses as the ones that, and as I have in one scene, they actually do, they're left behind, the wife and husband are left behind in a bar. But I have to say, in all honesty, what did I find difficult? The emotion, I think. I mean, I was very lucky to get to the CCI in Paris to work finish the novel there. I think Nuala worked on her novel there too. And I finished the last 3 chapters while I was there. And to be honest, I was sort of bereft when they left me. And I felt very sad saying goodbye to all of them. I suppose the only thing I was afraid of was to live up to the excellence of Bowen. And I'm not Bowen, and I'm not her. I can't write as she does. But I suppose I saw it as a tribute to her work.
Thank you. Nuala, how about you?
Yeah, same. Actually, I finished my novel in the CCI in Paris and had a little cry on the day I finished it, with that feeling of having to leave them now. Though you do get to come back to them in the edit and all of that. I suppose in terms of challenges, the main challenge when you're working with real people who lived, is creating something story-like out of their life, because lives are not plots. Now, obviously, Nora and James Joyce had plenty of eventful things happen to them, and Elman, Joyce's biographer, says Joyce throve on flurry. So he didn't just thrive on it, he created it. So with his excessive drinking, with the fact that he moved the family incessantly from address to address to address, from flat to flat. Stanley, Joyce's brother, said that Jim loved the excitement of events. And so James had a habit of creating these events in order to have things to write about, but just because he liked life that way, a little bit shallow in the roots, a little bit eventful, because let's face it, family life, essentially a very normal family life, even though they weren't married, they essentially carried on like married people with 2 children. It can create just a sort of an ordinary domestic situation. And he was teaching and he hated it. So he would do other things, like have these fancies for other women and pursue them, with letters and with dalliances and whatever, in order to ruffle his life a bit. He also had this money-making schemes. He opened a cinema in Dublin. He wanted to import tweed to Trieste, all this sort of stuff. So you have to take all those events that happened and the moving and the drinking. So the drinking caused rows. So there's your drama. So you gather all these pieces of drama and you make something story-like out of the lives of people. And because Giorgio, Joyce, Lucia and Nora were a little unit of 4 who moved a lot from country to country and from house to house, they very much became a very tight little unit, and they operated very privately within that unit. And so the drama is often familial when it's not to do with lack of money or things like that from the outside. So that's the challenge. And, novels are supposed to have plots. I'm personally not hugely interested in plot as a concept, but I do admire people who can write very plotty books at the same time. And I do like story, and something must happen in a novel. That's just the beginning and end of it. Something must happen. And so the things that happen in mine were we're creating emotion and scenes around these family obstacles as such. And that's the enjoyment of it, you know, and that's the challenge. And I hope that I achieved that, you know, all the upheaval and novelty that he craved. And Nora wasn't averse to novelty at all herself, that creates a story.
Yeah, and I think also something that both of you have touched on is this idea that the people around them, whether it's familial or friendship or lovers, that they also create the story. And that's what I really admire in both of your works, is that I forgot that I was, you know, reading a story and just entered into it entirely. And I think the books are written in very different language, but really, really interesting. You both chose really interesting words, which makes me think that you were, you know, inside those worlds. And there was certainly enough happening for me in the books. There was lots. And then I wondered what you found. I mean, you've mentioned this a bit, but what you each found really helpful as you were working through the process. You know, what you've both mentioned being in Paris. I mean, I know both of you have traveled extensively to go to the places where your people were, but what really kept you going? What were the most helpful things? So Ava, what would you say?
Travel was hugely important. I mean, I'm just devoted to my work. So in the line of my duty, I had to go to Rome all the time. You know, that was just something I was prepared to do. And
Yeah.
nothing, you know, you just don't spare yourself in that way. Well, I was very lucky, got to go to Rome. I was writing in Paris. I actually didn't realize that Bowen and Charles Ritchie used to spend a lot of time in the Luxembourg Gardens, which is very near where I was working. And I got to Hythe, I got to a lot of time to London. And then lucky, of course, I live near Farrahy in North Cork, which is where she's buried. And Dublin. And Dublin's very important to Bowen. I mean, she lovely memoir, Seven Winters. So I've one of the chapters is set in the Shelburne. She wrote a book about the Shelburne. There was a great controversy about the statues outside the Shelburne, which Bowen loved and described, and I used the word flambeau. And so I situated it in as many of the places connected to her. There's one, many of them, the scenes seem to be set in train stations or graveyards. I didn't plan that. So one of them is in Cork Station, Kent Station, which I'm very fond of, and the other is in Termini in Rome. So travel and place was hugely important. Her voice was hugely important. And I've been very lucky. Elizabeth Bowen died in 1973. I think I've spoken to about 9 people who knew her, and many of whom were at her funeral. So, I mean, it does seem quite a gap between now and then, but I was fortunate to have people surviving who knew her. And when I gave a reading in Paris, and a man came up at the end and introduced himself as a diplomat who had worked with Charles Ritchie in his career. So place, travel, and Charles Ritchie's diaries and Elizabeth Bowen's letters to Charles Ritchie were hugely important. They were crucial to that. And, you know, in the same way, I know Nuala was drawing hugely upon the Joyce letters and all of the materials around them. Anything like that is invaluable. And I spent some time at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas, working on Bowen's letters. But Charles Ritchie's own voice was hugely important to me. He was a very good writer and a very accomplished diarist and very, very hard on himself. So anything like that works. But actually, when I was writing the novel, I kept reading her the whole time. And I'm shameless about that. I kept going back to her stories, her wartime work, The Heat of the Day. And it's everywhere. And I make no apologies for that.
Nor should you, right? And Nuala, what was your inspirational process, I guess?
Yeah, the same. Research, the biographies, the letters, the testimonies from friends. I read Ulysses with a group at the James Joyce Center. But like, biofiction is speculative in the sense that you are creating probable scenes. Anthony Beevor calls this faction creep. He really doesn't approve of biofiction at all, as a historian, you know. But for us, we need to know about the inner life of the person, what motivates them, what moves them, the realities of their era. So you want not just the lives, but the location and the norms of the era to flare up around the reader, so that the reader feels like she's there, she's living this thing along with your character. And very much reading Eibhear's book, I felt that. I almost felt I was the characters. And that's what, as a writer, you're hoping to achieve. You're hoping to immerse the reader so much that they feel like they're living the thing. So it's a different thing to biography, to nonfiction. So reading all that stuff, the scholarly articles, etc., and then walking the ground, as Eibhear said. So I went to Zurich, I went to Trieste, I went to Paris, all with help from the Arts Council here, and obviously the residency in the CCI, the Centre Culturel in Paris, which is really just like, it was the greatest gift to me, a month there to walk around and see the addresses that Joyce has lived at, and see the cafes they ate and drank in, and just all of that immersion, so that you're dragging the atmosphere, because Paris hasn't changed that much, you're dragging the atmosphere into yourself and, you know, reproducing that on the page. So those are the things that that help sort of materially. And then of course we're writers, so it's the imagination, and it's about creating what Virginia Woolf called those moments of being. So, you know, when I was reading Eibhear's book and was really feeling hurt alongside Elizabeth and hurt alongside Sylvia, and all of those moments, those were the moments of being, the difficult scenes where somebody rings somebody who shouldn't be ringing somebody and someone else overhears it. And that's what you want to give your reader, that they're hurting alongside the characters. So when Jim, for example, comes home drunk yet again, and Nora has had to take in laundry because they have no money, and she's basically cleaning the dirty underdrawers of the Triestine people while he's out squandering money that could be better used for food or clothing. You want to feel her suffering alongside her, and I hope that readers will. So you're trying to create the texture of what it felt like to be poor and vulnerable in Trieste in 1904, a young woman who can't really go home now that she's eloped. You know, she has done a shameful thing in the mores of that era. And you want to get all that across without overloading the reader with too much detail. You know, you want them to feel like they're there, but not that they're being blasted, like as in a movie or something, with too many cultural references or whatever. So you want it to feel natural. So it's a kind of a, I find what I do is I research as I go along. So I'm drip feeding information to myself. I know the overall picture, but I'm drip feeding so that, like Nora, I don't know, you know, in a sense, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what the next scene is. And so that I'm moving along with her. That's kind of my idea, or was my idea when I was writing it. And it seemed to work. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Spent 2 years writing that novel and just loved it. I would happily skip to my desk every morning. I just loved it.
Yeah, no, I think that comes through, that both of your joy in the process. I mean, it obviously was not without its difficulties, but the joy of being immersed in it came through. And Nuala, I'm really struck by what you said about how you drip fed it to yourself and also to your reader. And what I'm struck by in both of your work is how you gave enough so that we could get a world without being overwhelmed. So like just enough to kind of almost like a miniature portrait, like we could see the scene, we could understand what we needed to, and then we could be there for what was going to unfold. And I think you mentioned dragging the atmosphere into yourself, and I think you did that.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. It's atmosphere, isn't it? And Eibhear's book has that in spades. The atmosphere is so intense in that book, in all of the different scenes, whether it's Regent's Park or whether it's a bedroom, whether you're in the Shelbourne Hotel, you are there. The atmosphere just envelops you. And I think it's a huge skill, Eibhear, and I salute you. It's a wonderful novel.
Thank you, Nora. Nora. I started doing this, Nuala. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
No, and actually, I know you don't mind. So, I mean, I know the Nora, Joyce, Jim stories so well. So when I started reading your novel, I mean, I'm read it, of course, with familiarity, and as we all do, and you know, I think their stories are well known. But I suppose two things kind of caught me by surprise when I was reading. I read it in 2 days, as you know. how moved I was at the description of her joy at the book when Nora gets Ulysses, and what a big deal it is to her, which I'm sure, you know, and also her grief at his death. I mean, I thought, you know, you think you just don't, it was kind of a freshness, a realization to say, well, you know, that both things were, you know, that her grief was, and they'd had a very difficult time during the war, unlike sort of Bowen, who was enervated about the war. I think the Joyce family suffered quite a lot during the Second War, and his death was tragic and sudden and, you know, painful for her. But to remember, I mean, the word I think should be used, what you're creating is a love story, and she did love him. And I think you forget that. You just do. You know, this one knows the story so well, and he dedicates the novel and places on the first day that they met, the day that his life began for him, and her pride in the book, and you know, all the things that, and her grief at his passing. I thought, you know, I just wasn't expecting those, and it's sometimes fiction reminds us of things that, because I'm also a critic, that you forget. You know what I mean? That you forget. And the other thing I always feel about being a critic and also being a novelist is that being a novelist is a lot easier.
Yeah.
Because actually you can the critic, you need to be careful and go through everything and deal with everything and deal with all the scholarship. But with a novel, you're focused to get the atmosphere, get the story, and leave out the things that should be left out. They stand in the way of the work that you need to do, the atmosphere that you need to create.
And you're curating all the time. You're picking out the bits that you're going to, and you're doing it from a slant. You know, you're taking a position. Like, you know, Nora has been criticized a lot in the past about her treatment of Lucia. I don't know where that came from, but there's this sort of general feeling that she didn't treat her well. But from my point of view, she really did. She was a mother who loved her daughter, who could see that her daughter needed help, and she was determined to get her that help. Jim was the one who was in denial. Giorgio is the one who first had Lucia committed, and yet Nora in our patriarchal society gets the blame. You know, she could see, and Lucia was ill, she was volatile, she had a penchant for, you know, going out without underwear, naked swimming, living on a diet of champagne and fruit and cigarettes. She was often violent. She wasn't well. And it was Nora, because Jim was busy writing or drinking at night. It was Nora who had the care of Lucia. And Lucia was often violent towards Nora. I mean, that is not easy. She was in her mid-20s at this stage. She was a strong individual, lithe from dancing. So, you know, there must have been a lot of fear as well around Lucia's strength and violence, you know, and Nora dealt with that as best she could. And people say, oh, well, she didn't visit her. Well, she was told not to by the doctors. The doctors said, you excite her, you should stay away. And she wanted to go. But like when Jim and Giorgio visited her, she also physically attacked them. So it wasn't just Nora. I just feel like there's this bad mother thing that people love to latch onto that I don't feel is justified in this case at all.
No, I think you really remade. I mean, that was the thing I struck, because I think, you know, and Nora, as you portray her, sees the mistakes that she's making, and she's trying to stop herself, as we all do. In a difficult situation, she tries to stop saying certain things to Lucia, but after a certain point, Lucia's illness is overwhelming, and she's afraid of her. And I thought, and I didn't feel, I don't know what you thought, but I thought Jim as well, you know, he dealt with it in his way, neither perfectly well or perfectly badly, but with love. And he loved her, and he was different, and it was a different relationship. And Nora perhaps was the focus of much more of Lucia's anger than her father, as I believe I've read, and as I think you portray.
Absolutely.
So it's a complex one, in which I think at the center is a tragedy of her illness, and her parents' fear of her. And I thought you didn't judge anyone. I mean, in my novel, there's judgment around, I suppose, the notion of having a relationship outside of marriage, or, you know, the way in which that works. In your novel, I suppose there's judgment around parental behavior then, and was Nora the right mother, and judgment on mother. I mean, I think you caught that sense of people trying to do the best they could. And I mean, Nora catching herself and saying, you know, if she says something, she knows she'll irritate Lucia, and trying not to. She wasn't perfect, but she was struggling.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about this, the business of being bohemian, but even bohemians have very soft hearts and can get hurt very easily. And I felt that about my bohemians that I was dealing with their veneer of respectability, and your bohemians with exactly the same thing, but in a different circumstance. That
Mhm.
they're having all these extramarital affairs and they're kind of okayed by the spouses, but they're not really, because the spouses are hurting, you know, everybody's hurting,
Mm.
but on they go, you know. And I was talking about it with my husband earlier, you know, that really it's just such a difficult situation that Elizabeth was in. She was in this
Mm.
horror show of loving this man who would not commit to her, you know. And what could she do, you know?
I thought you both did a really beautiful job. It's funny, I read both books in 2 days, just this kind of immersive reading experience. And Nuala, what you did with the mother-daughter relationship, I thought was really stunning, because you really made us relook at it in the ways that you're talking about. And Ava, I thought, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read it yet, but I thought what Ava did with not only with the complexities of the love stories, but also with Elizabeth Bowen's not having children, I thought was a really powerful discussion. And it strikes me as we should probably wrap up this part of the program in a couple minutes. But what strikes me is that you were both dealing with such delicate, sensitive, intimate parts of people's lives. And you both did so with such, I thought, humility and kindness and humanity. And that, especially, I mean, I know the pandemic is like something that we can't really get away from at the moment, but reading both of your books, Ava, I read yours earlier on in the pandemic, and Nuala, obviously yours a bit later, but this what you give us, I think, are both great gifts in the sense of being able to escape into these worlds that offer, a different vantage point, especially when we're all kind of stuck in our houses or wherever we're stuck.
Thanks.
So yeah, so thank you. And we have some questions from the audience. We try to do a couple things at once, which I'm not very good at, but there's a question that I thought was interesting. Well, they're all interesting, but a question really for both of you or either of you is, did Nora Joyce ever meet Elizabeth Bowen? Did James Joyce and Elizabeth Bowen meet? Did they refer to each other's work? So maybe thinking about this conversation in terms of the cross-pollination, if there was any.
I'm sort of surprised. I mean, I saw the question, so I was thinking about it. Bowen wrote 2 very good essays on Joyce, and I've included them in an edition I've done of Elizabeth Bowen's Irish writings, because they're so good. And she was an early and a really good critic of Joyce, and she wrote, I think, possibly for, I can't remember, was it for the Irish Times, or certainly it was for maybe the New Statesman on the occasion of his death. So she was asked to write, and she also wrote about Finnegan's Wake and was prepared to write about him. So, I mean, Bowen visited certainly Paris in the 1930s. And we know, for example, that she went to see Yeats, and we know of her, she was well enough connected. I have no record of the meeting or of her saying it. And it's a surprising lack, because if she'd wanted to, she could have. I mean, she was very well connected and, very well thought of in the literary world. So there's no, I don't believe so, because I'd have no account of it. Nuala, I don't think you've come across it either.
No.
Funny, we haven't talked about that, but it's not been there. What they would have made of all of each other, I think, would have been very interesting.
Yes.
I'm sure Woolf and Bowen had interesting conversations about Joyce.
Yes, I think, in my opinion, Bowen is better on Joyce than Woolf. I mean, but though, I mean, Woolf, she understood what he was doing. But yes, they would have had interesting. But 3 Irish, and I mean, Bowen was Irish, as she said herself, 3 Irish people meeting in Paris like that. Maybe we should imagine it as an encounter. I don't know. I mean, the 2 women would certainly have been well able to pass themselves in terms of conversation. I presume Jim, depending on what he wanted, might or not have involved. But I could certainly imagine Nora and Elizabeth sort of being well able to pass an hour together. in terms
Absolutely,
of
because they were
both
both
Irish
great,
women.
yeah, and
Yeah.
great hostesses. They both loved to entertain.
Oh yeah.
And so they would have had that in common, you know, and loved style, both extremely stylish, you know.
Mhm. I mean, they're
Yeah.
both older. I'm just thinking dates wise, obviously, Nora and Jim were a good, so nearly 20 years older than her. So that would have been, you know, they would have been of a different generation. But certainly, yes, it's nice to imagine it. Maybe we should write it.
Yeah, we could imagine them coming for tea. I love, Nuala, what you did with the materiality of objects, you know, the china, and
I'm
then
obsessed with material culture, yeah, so it gets in everywhere.
yeah, but in a wonderful way, because I think that was part of how you grounded it, you know, and made it so visually appealing. So it's fun to think about what they might have done together if they had met. And then we have another question, which is one I was thinking of asking, but another person asked it. So do you think about a particular kind of reader or audience as you write, or are you the reader you're writing for? So Nuala, maybe you want to have a stab at that.
No, I never have a reader in mind. I think we were talking about audacity earlier on. Ava mentioned the audacity of taking on Bowen as, you know, as a man and whatever. But yeah, there's always that little question of audacity at the start. So when I took on Emily Dickinson, I was like, oh, you know, American icon, what am I doing? But
Yeah.
very quickly, when you get into the research and the writing, you absolutely forget about that stuff because you start to fall in love. Your research throws up such wonderful details like I'm just thinking of a detail in Eibhear's book that is just so swoony as a reader and must have been even swoonier as a researcher. The curtains in Bowen's court made out of corset material was just like, oh, I love it, you know.
Yeah.
So you begin to get immersed in the thing, and all notions of this not being allowed to do that go out the window very quickly. If you kept in your head everyone who might criticize, you would never write the thing. What you're hoping for in your reader is someone who feels as warmly towards your people as you do, and knowing that they are human, flawed, a little broken, you know, a little crazy, maybe not the most likable people in the world, but wonderful because of that. I'm an empath, so I tend to like people who are a little bit off the wall, and love them even more maybe because they're not you know, giddy and gay and straightforward, because I'm none of those things. I'm complex and cranky, and you know, so I kind of like people that are like that. And I love Nora and Jim's love of song and story, and because that all appeals to me, you know, and their deep devotion to language. So I don't ever have a reader in mind. I suppose I think about my lovely agent Grania and hope she'll like it. That's maybe the only thing I think about.
It's good to have an ideal, I mean, to have another person or two in your life, and I'm very lucky with that, who read your work first, and to say, and if you're lucky to have a good agent, and if you're lucky to have publishers that you know can work with. But I suppose ultimately you write for yourself. And you, was it somebody said about Charles Dickens, he didn't write books that people wanted to read, he wrote books that he wanted to read. Something like that. I'm kind of paraphrasing about that. It wasn't so much that he kind of exploited the Victorian imagination, he was that imagination. And I suppose that's always been, yeah. And I mean, yeah, the thing about the corset material, I just thought, well, how am I going to use it? And I just thought, if you tell somebody something, then they can't forget it.
No.
Somebody tells you a thing and you think, oh my God, every time you look at it, you're thinking that thing, you know. So yeah, it's that idea of, you know, you come across a fact and you think, I can't, that has to go in, that has to stay there, you know.
Yeah, so much gorgeous detail in your book, though. You know, not just that material stuff, but just, oh, the subtlety of the pain I just found incredible.
And I think with both of your books, but I know Ava's landscape better, the idea, like, I don't think I'll ever be able to walk in Regent's Park again and see the roses without imagining your book because of the scenes with the roses. And I remember the
Well,
first
Heather, do you want to confess the story?
I think you should tell it.
I was lucky enough to be in London launching my Handel book at the Handel House, and Heather was very kindly there. And with my partner Saul and Heather, the three of us went and we knocked at the Bowen's door in Regent's Park, expecting Bowen to come out. That is true. we took a long time. We rang at the doorbell and we stood there, and yeah, we probably thought she was going to come out. So yeah, you do yeah, you inhabit the book in a way that, you know, it becomes your landscape too. And Bowen is so good on that. I mean, that's partly why what most interested me and taught me most as a writer, I think, for this book, was Bowen's understanding of how landscape becomes animated by our interior world. And she's brilliant on that, and she's brilliant on light. And I tried in as much as I could to emulate it or translate into my own terms, you know. So as you say, Regent's Park becomes a place. For me, Nassau Street is always Nora and Jim.
Yeah,
you know.
me too. Yeah, but you succeeded. You succeeded. That whole thing about light is so apparent to me as a reader in your book. It's completely there. You brought the house alive. Like, I grieve for Bowen's Court as a Bowen fan, but like, I'm nearly weeping over your book because I know it's no longer there, and I'm in those rooms. I feel like I know those rooms. I said this to someone in Annaghmakerrig during the summer about how I grieve for that house, and she said, so do I. You know, she was just shocked that someone else would too. Maybe we're all grieving for it, you know, but it's, your book is visceral in that way. You're there, you're with her, you're living it.
And she set it up for us because she wrote the description at the end of when the house was gone, and she said, as if it's still there. And that's the key. The house was gone, but it was alive for her. So I mean, that was my kind of key in to trying to find those worlds. And Charles Ritchie mourned Bowen's Court as much as he mourned her. He lost 2 chances in his life. And that's one of the things as we all do. We all lose things. We don't do the right things at the right moment, and he regrets it. And that's life, you know.
And I think, kind of to finish up Eibhear's story about going to the house, he's the one who dared me to knock on the door.
Exactly.
I'm the one who knocked. And then when we were leaving, because nobody came, we were walking down the street and the house was behind us, and we looked back and there was kind of the shimmering light through a tree, and we kind of persuaded ourselves that it was actually Bowen, you know, in her drawing room looking down at us. But it is interesting how the light was recreated. I don't think, Nuala, I'll ever be able to look China the same way, that the way that China inhabited your book in remarkable ways, and also place. So we have another question that kind of relates, I think, for both of you. So Eibhear, how did you manage not to be infected by Bowen's characteristic prose style? And Nuala, how about you and the Joycean style? Maybe Nuala, you could share what your relationship was to the Joycean style, we might say, as you were writing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I wasn't going to try and emulate Joyce, but I would have to say that the language of Joyce's home place is the language of my home place. I grew up in County Dublin. My parents both grew up in the same place, Mill Lane in Palmerstown in Dublin. And their language was very much, we had a kind of a sheltered childhood. So their language was very much the language of their parents who had lived there as well. So my parents grew up near each other. So we had this kind of old-fashioned Dublin language, if you want to put it that way, that survived into my childhood. And so a lot of the phrases and things that you hear in Joyce's plays and in his books, or in dramatizations of Joyce that you read in the books, is the language of my childhood. And so I feel very confident using that. I've lived in Galway for 25 years. And so I know a little about the language here as well. So I try to bring both things into the sound of the novel, the Galway voice of Nora and the Dublin voice of Joyce. And I did use some of the expressions that I found in Portrait, that I found in Ulysses. Not a lot, because you don't want to be too knowing about it either. So I would slip some of them in, and some of the stuff from the letters, things he would have said to Stanny in a letter, I would have him say to him, you know, as they ate their dinner or whatever. So that sort of thing. You know, I had already written a story. I was asked to take part in a project that the Irish Writers' Centre did, where we rewrote Ulysses for the 21st century, and we were each assigned a chapter. Well, I was allowed to pick my chapter, so obviously I picked the Penelope. So I've already written a story in the voice of Molly Bloom set now. So I felt like I didn't want to parody Molly Bloom as Nora. I wanted Nora to be herself, to be that Galway girl, not to be the woman from Gibraltar / Ireland, you know. So Yeah, you're playing around a lot with different things, and there's a lot of thought process that you're having. As Ava was saying earlier about when you're writing something like this, you are completely immersed in it. So it's eating, drinking, sleeping the thing. You know, you bring Nora around with you. Like, I use my husband as a sounding board. He's not a writer, he's an IT person, and he doesn't have to answer me. I will just say things to him, and I just need to hear these things said out loud. So I bring Nora to the dinner table, which results in my kids knowing about these people. I think my youngest daughter thinks that we're friends with these people almost. She talks about Emily Dickinson and Belle Bilton and Nora Barnacle as if they're people we know. They're a natural part of the conversation here. And that's what happens. Even my fictional characters, I have a fictional character very closely based on me in another novel, and I think of her as real. I thought I saw her in Galway one day. I know it sounds nuts, but it's just what happens to you. You become the thing, and you really it envelops you as much as you envelop it. And I think that's a good thing in order to get the work done.
Yeah, no, I think you have to completely enter into it as you did. And Ava, how about you? I know Bowen at one point said she didn't want to read Henry James when she was writing because he was infectious like a rash, like the measles. But I don't know what you would say.
I mean, I can't write as well as her, and I never will. And I admire her hugely. I tried to translate into my own writing her wonderful, wonderful, wonderful descriptions of buildings and places and houses and rooms and light. But interestingly, I wanted to also get the dialogue right. So I did read her, but actually who I found much maybe to help me, I'm a huge fan of anything written by anyone called Mitford. So any of the letters, diaries, novels of Nancy Mitford, Jessica, any of them, I wanted to get the language of that society and of that world. And they did know each other. Elizabeth knew Gaston Palowansky, who had been Nancy Mitford's lover for many years. So their lives interconnected. So I wanted to get the language of that kind of society. And both Bowen and Ritchie were outsiders to some degree, Anglo-Irish and Canadian. But what's very clear is that they both passed very much within that world. Charles Ritchie was very welcome. He'd been to Oxford, and Bowen herself was very welcome to that society and much loved. So a bit like Wilde, I kind of thought, well, they're outsiders though. And it's kind of how they operate within that world. But also I wanted Teresa, the housekeeper, I wanted her voice, which is easier for me, probably nearer to my own worlds. And yeah, I just wanted to get everyone's voice right. And I think many of the Anglo-Irish women, particularly that I wrote about, were very much the same or identical to the English women of their own class, of the equivalent class. So I suppose I wanted to get voice right, but I could never write as well as Bowen, and I certainly can't. I don't have her bold imaginative, and same as Joyce's bold imaginative ability to make new fiction, make new forms. And that's what I admire about both of them so much. I can't do that. This is something different. This is a very contemporary novel, which kind of turned out to be much more contemporary than I thought, because it came out in lockdown, and it's about a world where a world turned upside down. So all of those parallels helped as well. But Bowen, just admiration for her work, but I don't think I was infected by it. But certainly I can't write as well as Elizabeth Bowen. I never could. I never will.
But you both created something out of the writers that you were living with. That I think, it's not so much as that are you as good a writer as she is. It's just you were doing something very different and very beautiful in your own way. So we have another question, which is both, how much do you draw on your personal experience to describe these figures? So Nuala, starting with you, how did yourself as a mother come into play? And then Ava, we can see what you think. Yeah,
I suppose I drew on my own experience of, say, for example, breastfeeding. There's breastfeeding scenes in the, with Giorgio. Lucia didn't take to the breast much. And just the love of little tiny people, and then how they change when they become teenagers. So I have scenes where Giorgio is this big, awkward lump, and I have two big sons as well as my small daughter. So you draw hugely on your own thing. And then I suppose there's a a good bit of intimate scenes, and you draw somewhat from your own experience of those as well. Yeah, you do. Like, I mean, you're coming at every piece of fiction you write with your own passions, your own biases, your background, your knowledge, your language store. Your whole personality comes at it, and you weave that in, however much you may think that you don't.
Yeah.
It's usually very obvious to you when you've removed yourself from the book for a bit. So I finished this book 2 years ago. It's coming out now because it's been going through the agent editorial process, then the selling process, then the editor process, then the cover. All of that stuff took a couple of years. So I have some distance from it now. And yeah, you can look back and see exactly what's directly from your mouth or your mother's mouth or whoever's mouth you're stealing it from. And I can definitely see it with my older novels. I can see where it's all me, you know, whereas maybe a few years ago, I might have denied that I was as present as I am in my work. I'm older now, so I can acknowledge that I am there.
Yeah, I thought your descriptions about, particularly of, well, all of motherhood, but particularly of being a mother of young children, and that you have something about the kind of the infant time just being ever present throughout a day. And then, you know, as they get older, they kind of stop in and out. And I thought you portrayed that really, really beautifully. So Ava, in terms of your...
Interesting, I've just thought, the 3 novels I've written, none of the main characters have children. And that's just only occurred to me now. And I didn't pick them for those reasons. And I think certainly in all the novels, I have children or young people. In fact, yes, because Handel, in my second novel, he has there's a young woman, a young teenager who sings. I have the scene, and she's still very young looking, but she has this remarkably beautiful voice. It's someone I heard years ago in a choir, a very still a young girl, really, with a almost completely adult, beautiful voice. But yeah, none of my, as it happens, none of my characters in my main 3 novels none of them have children. But I've made a point, actually, if I noticed, and I deliberately did it with Bowen, because I've known a number of people who knew her when they were children, and they loved her. They really loved her. And Bowen writes so well about children and adolescents, in my opinion. Yeah. And so movingly, partly from herself and partly from that, I wanted to put in a child that liked her and that she liked, because I suppose I wanted to write about the wonderful experience of not having children yourself, but being lucky enough to form nice, you know, connections with, if you're lucky enough to know either just through family and whatever, and, you know, have that kind of, what she had, a kind of an almost an aunt-like relationship or godmother-like relationship. And she did have them, I know that. And it's not a view of her that would have been perhaps generally held. I think Bowen has a slightly intimidating public presence. I mean, she dressed, I think, deliberately in this very striking and very powerful way. And, you know, her possession of a big house and her social abilities. When you hear her talking, there are 1 or 2 recordings of her voice. Her voice was remarkably light and pretty and beguiling. And you would think of her as a woman, perhaps like Kate O'Brien, who had a lovely, rich voice, very suited for radio. Bowen's voice is like, she sounds like the late Queen Mother, who I think she was related to, who she's about the same age of, and who probably has similar education. But it's a very pretty, very appealing voice. And I suppose that interests me about Bowen. I just wanted to show that side of her because it existed. And no one could write so well about children as Bowen without having that empathy. And I think she drew upon her own very, perhaps, broken and scattered childhood and adolescence, particularly her adolescence. And, you know, paralleling very much Nuala's sense of, I think, the children of Giorgio and Lucia as, you know, they're sort of the life moving from place to place, a bit like Eva Trout, Bowen's wonderful last novel, a girl who's living a life that's almost derelict, even though she's really rich. And I mean, I think Bowen was so insightful into adolescence and into kind of a sense of children's and adolescent sense, lack of place, Portia in The Death of the Heart, many of her characters, that I wanted to write that. So yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, where Nuala, I think, writes so importantly about motherhood, and it's particularly for Nora, the judgment around it. I suppose for me, I was interested in the other for Bowen, when you don't have children, what that means to both a writer and to a person. And again, there's an issue around why Bowen and her husband had no children. I offer an explanation. It's as good as any. It's a slightly lazy assumption that her husband was gay. I've never seen any evidence for it one way or the other. He might have been, he might not have been. I just think it's kind of a, you know, perhaps it, who knows? But this is another version of what I'm trying to, this is my version of their marriage.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I have one last question. You both clearly love who you write about. Should you write about someone you don't love? Interesting question.
I think no matter how despicable a person is, when you write about someone and you immerse yourself in them that way, you discover that people are not 100% anything. So if you think about terrible as such characters from literature, like Humbert from Lolita, like awful person but so funny and so compelling. You think about someone like Silence of the Lambs, you know, Lecter is absolutely awful, but again, he's extremely compelling. I doubt if the writers of those novels hated their characters. You find things to like about them. Like Joyce was not a particularly, I wouldn't like to be his friend, let me put it that way. I don't think he'd like me anyway, because he only liked certain types of women, and I don't think I'd be the type he liked, but I still love him because I recognize all the good parts of him, his kindness to Nora, his consideration of her, his generosity, his desire to give her everything she wanted, even when they had no money. You know, he bought her the most thoughtful gifts, and he splurged on her, sometimes to her annoyance because they didn't have money for food. He'd come home with a beautiful scarf and she'd say, "Get that out of my sight, you know, bring me home a pound of potatoes or something," you know. I suppose I probably wouldn't write about someone I absolutely hated, because it would be difficult to go to the desk every day for 2 years to someone that I just really disliked. I'm writing about another feisty woman now, and you know, she makes very strange life choices, but you know, I'm just following her along. It's another real person. And wondering about her choices and probably trying to find reasons for them to give to the reader. But again, I have just completely fallen in love with her. There's very little about her on the historical record, so I'm very free to invent with this one. But I just love her feistiness, her disregard for her era in the sense of what women were supposed to be. This is actually, I've gone further back this time. I'm in the 1800s. So yeah, it's interesting. I'm in the 1700s, I should say. Yeah, I probably wouldn't spend 2 years with someone I loathed. I have to find something to like about them.
Yeah. And Eibhear, how about you?
I have that option. I have an idea. I've had an idea for many years. I'm not going to tell you who it is, but it's a real figure, and he was a demagogue, and he held Britain to ransom over quite a period of time and whipped up an enormous public plot against a group of people, and resulting in a lot of death and a lot of destruction. I mean, it's nothing we can experience in our lives, so we don't know. Obviously, this is nothing we're experiencing at the moment, but he's just a horrible character, and I've been kind of toying with the idea of him for years, and he existed, and it was a real thing. But I'd only could do it if I felt at some level either someone around him I liked, or that there was a kind of, almost a kind of a saving grace, because as Nuala was saying, I think of the great villains of literature, Richard III, and I'm thinking of the great Dickens characters that were, or Count Fosco, is that his name, in The Woman in White, or, you know, there's whole series. I'm trying to think of other characters. I mean, is Heathcliff likable? I suppose he's romantic, you know, there's all sorts of things about him. Who knows? But like, to want to write about someone very dark, you need to either have a relish for their kind of villainy, or some sense in which they can kind of survive anything, that everything gets thrown at them. You have to find something to admire in them. I might do it. I haven't done it yet. And the next novel I'm working on won't be, it's the opposite, someone I love dearly and who I want to write about, very, whose death was very tragic, but it'll be very different. But yeah, maybe sometime I'll write a supervillain and find something in them that redeems. It also helps if the first character I wrote about, Mary Travers, was not a likable woman. And she was a difficult woman who did destructive things, and everything she did, I wouldn't do. But that's probably what I liked about her. All my caution would not be hers and all that sort of stuff. So who knows? Maybe we find an opposition as well. And maybe our characters do the things that we don't dare do in our own lives.
I think there's an element of that sometimes, yeah. And I think never say never about anything in writing. I would have had firm beliefs 10 years ago that are completely gone out the window now. Sometimes I look back at old interviews and I think, what was I on about? That's rubbish. Thankfully, we learn every day and we grow every day, especially as writers. I have a little sign above my desk attributed to Michelangelo. It says, "I'm still learning." And I look at that every day and think, yeah, that's it. It's all journey writing. There's no end point. It's all just going on. And as long as you're enjoying it, I think that's the main thing. And I love it. I have to say, I just love it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing to say, Nuala, that you're still learning and will continue to learn as you write more books. So thank you both so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you all. Yes, I'm popping back in just to say that was a wonderful, beautiful discussion of two just lovely books. So this was such a treat. Thank you both so much. Thank all three of you so much for being here today. I'll just let the audience know that we're all done. Thank you for coming. I put some information in the chat about how to purchase the books, also 2 short videos of the author's reading. So please feel free to check those out. And yes, just a round of applause for you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I will slowly and awkwardly end this session. So again, to the audience, go ahead and copy and paste those links before we forget. And I will go ahead and end this. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.